Wir müssen
Berlin,
jetzt alle
January
zusammenstehen.
1919.
Für die
The
Freiheit
war
und
is
für unsere
over,
Zukunft.
but peace has brought
Kein
no
Rückzug
relief.
vor den
Soldiers who
Herausforderungen.
marched
Wir
home as
fordern unser
heroes
Recht
now
jetzt.
stand in bread lines, coats stripped of insignia, eyes hollow with a question no one can answer. What were the sacrifices for? Somewhere in the corridors of a fractured government, men are signing documents that will decide the fate of 80 million people, and none of those people were asked. Within a generation, the nation that produces this moment will watch its currency become worthless paper, its parliament dissolve into shouting matches and gunfire, and its citizens trade the promise of democracy for the certainty of a strong man. This is not a story about a single villain. It is a story about something far more dangerous: the slow, systemic erosion of a state's most fragile resource, the belief of its own people that it will protect them. Once that belief cracks, institutions do not fall all at once. They're hollowed out year by year, betrayal by betrayal, until the shell that remains can be knocked over by a single push. How does a nation lose its people's trust? And once lost, can it ever be rebuilt? Or does it only clear the ground for something worse to rise in its place? To understand collapse, we must first return to the illusion of victory, and the moment an empire discovered it had already lost the one thing it needed most. In November 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent, and the German Empire that had marched to war 4 years earlier as one of the most powerful states in the world sat at the negotiating table not as a victor, but as a defeated power whose own people did not yet understand the scale of the defeat. For 4 years, wartime censorship and official propaganda had assured German citizens that the front was holding, that victory remained within reach. So when the armistice was announced, it did not feel like the natural conclusion of a lost war. It felt like a betrayal, sudden and inexplicable, delivered by politicians rather than earned or lost by soldiers on the battlefield. This gap between what citizens had been told and what had actually happened became the first fracture in the foundation of trust between a state and its people, a fracture that would never fully heal. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile in the Netherlands, leaving behind a vacuum that moderate socialist politicians, led by Friedrich Ebert, scrambled to fill. On the same day the Republic was declared from a balcony of the Reichstag, a rival declaration of a socialist republic was shouted from a nearby palace balcony, a symbolic collision that foreshadowed the fractured, contested nature of the state now being born. This new government, soon organized under a constitution drafted in the city of Weimar, inherited not only the practical burdens of a broken economy and a demobilizing army, but also the political burden of having to sign the peace. The Treaty of Versailles, finalized in the summer of 1919, imposed harsh territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations payments on Germany, and it included Article 231, which assigned Germany moral responsibility for the war. For millions of Germans, the treaty was not simply a difficult settlement. It was proof that their new government had sold out the nation. A myth began to spread and take root with dangerous speed. The idea that the German army had not truly been defeated on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by politicians, socialists, and revolutionaries at home. This myth was false, but its power did not depend on its accuracy. It depended on how badly people needed someone to blame, and the new republic, simply by existing and signing the treaty, became the most convenient target available. From its earliest days, then, the Weimar Republic carried an inherited deficit of legitimacy that no government could easily overcome. It had not been chosen in a moment of national unity, but had emerged from defeat, and its founding act, accepting the terms of Versailles, was for a large portion of the population interpreted as an act of national humiliation rather than responsible statecraft. Trust in a state is built, in part, on the belief that the state represents and defends the interests of its people. When a significant share of the population comes to believe the opposite, that the state has capitulated to external humiliation and internal betrayal, the psychological foundation for stability is already compromised before a single policy has failed. The early years of the Republic offered little to repair this deficit. In 1920, right-wing paramilitary groups and disaffected military units attempted to overthrow the government entirely in what became known as the Kapp Putsch, an armed seizure of Berlin that was defeated not by loyal government forces, who largely refused to intervene, but by a general strike of workers who paralyzed the city and made it impossible for the plotters to govern. The episode revealed something crucial and unsettling. The state's own security apparatus, the very institutions meant to protect it, could not be relied upon to defend it. The Republic survived its first major crisis, not because of institutional strength, but because ordinary citizens intervened where the state's own defenders would not. Political violence did not end there. Throughout the early 1920s, assassins linked to right-wing nationalist organizations murdered prominent Republican politicians, including the Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau in 1922, a killing that shocked the nation and exposed how far political extremism had penetrated segments of German society willing to use murder as a political tool. Court systems, still staffed in many cases by judges sympathetic to the old imperial order, frequently treated right-wing political violence with striking leniency, while left-wing uprisings were suppressed with far greater severity. This asymmetry in the application of justice sent an unmistakable signal to citizens across the political spectrum. The state's institutions were not neutral guardians of law, but selective enforcers whose sympathies could be read in the sentences they handed down. For those on the left, this confirmed the state was a tool of reactionary elites. For those on the far right, paradoxically, it emboldened the belief that violence against the Republic carried little real risk. Then, in 1923, the economic foundation of daily life itself began to collapse. Germany defaulted on reparations payments, prompting French and Belgian troops to occupy the industrial Ruhr region to extract resources directly. The German government responded by encouraging passive resistance and continued paying striking workers by printing money it did not have. The result was one of the most extreme hyperinflations in modern history. Prices that had been stable in January soared to unimaginable levels by autumn. Citizens carried cash in wheelbarrows to buy basic goods, and workers were paid multiple times per day because wages became worthless within hours. Savings accumulated over a lifetime, pensions, insurance policies, the financial security of the middle class, were annihilated in a matter of months. This was not an abstract economic statistic. It was the direct, visceral experience of watching a state fail at its most basic function, providing a stable currency people could trust to hold its value. For an entire generation of middle-class Germans, the hyperinflation became a formative trauma, proof in the most literal sense that the institutions of the state could not be relied upon to protect what they had spent their lives building. The currency crisis was eventually stabilized through the introduction of a new currency and international financial arrangements, most notably the Dawes Plan of 1924, which restructured reparations payments and opened the door to a period of relative recovery. Under the stewardship of Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann, Germany experienced several years of comparative calm between 1924 and 1929, marked by re-entry into international diplomacy through the Locarno Treaties and admission to the League of Nations. Culturally, this period produced extraordinary innovation in architecture, cinema, science, and the arts, centered in a Berlin that had become one of the most vibrant cities in Europe. On the surface, it appeared the Republic might be consolidating the trust it had struggled to earn. But this stability was more fragile than it appeared, resting heavily on a continuous inflow of American loans and investment. When the New York stock market collapsed in October 1929, triggering the Great Depression, the flow of credit that had underwritten Germany's fragile recovery reversed almost overnight. American banks recalled loans. German industrial production contracted sharply. Unemployment climbed towards 6 million people by the early 1930s, an almost unimaginable scale of economic devastation for a population that had already endured the trauma of hyperinflation less than a decade earlier. For millions of Germans, the Depression did not read as an isolated economic downturn. It read as confirmation of a pattern that the Republic's institutions were structurally incapable of protecting ordinary citizens from catastrophe, whether the crisis came from military defeat, foreign occupation, currency collapse, or global financial contagion. Each crisis compounded the last, and with every compounding, the reservoir of public patience and institutional trust drained further. The parliamentary system itself began to seize up under this pressure. Weimar's constitution used a system of proportional representation that allowed a wide array of political parties into the Reichstag, from communists to monarchists to explicitly anti-republican nationalist movements, making it extraordinarily difficult to form stable governing coalitions. As the economic crisis deepened, coalition governments fell in rapid succession, unable to agree on how to address mass unemployment without alienating one faction or another. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging war hero who had never been an enthusiastic supporter of the republic he now led, increasingly turned to Article 48 of the Constitution, an emergency powers provision that allowed the president to rule by decree, bypassing the Reichstag entirely. What had been designed as a rare safety valve for genuine emergencies became, in the final years of the Republic, close to the ordinary method of governance. Citizens watching this process absorbed a corrosive lesson. Parliamentary democracy itself appeared unable to function, reinforcing the argument, made increasingly loudly by extremist parties on both the far left and far right, that the entire system was broken beyond repair and needed to be replaced rather than reformed. It was into this accumulating vacuum of institutional trust that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler, expanded from a marginal fringe movement into a mass political force. Hitler had first attempted to seize power directly in 1923 through the failed beer hall putsch in Munich, an armed uprising that collapsed within a day and led to his brief imprisonment, during which he wrote Mein Kampf. Rather than abandoning his ambitions, Hitler emerged from prison having concluded that power would need to be won through legal political means rather than armed insurrection, exploiting the very electoral system he intended ultimately to destroy. Through the stable years of the mid-1920s, the Nazi Party remained a minor presence, drawing only a small percentage of the vote. But as the Depression deepened after 1929, the party's message that the Republic was weak, corrupt, humiliated by Versailles, and controlled by hostile internal enemies, found an increasingly receptive audience among voters who had lost faith that existing institutions could rescue them. In the 1930 election, the Nazi Party's Reichstag seats surged dramatically. By July 1932, it had become the largest single party in the Reichstag, though still short of an outright majority. What made this rise possible was not simply the appeal of Nazi ideology in isolation, but the collapse of confidence in every available alternative. Communists offered revolution, which terrified the middle class and property owners still traumatized by the hyperinflation. Moderate Republican parties appeared powerless to halt economic catastrophe. Conservative elites around Hindenburg, deeply skeptical of both democracy and Hitler personally, increasingly believed they could use Hitler's popular movement for their own purposes, appointing him chancellor in January 1933 in the calculation that they could contain and control him within a conservative-dominated cabinet. This was among the most consequential miscalculations in modern political history. The belief among Germany's traditional power brokers that a movement built on the systematic destruction of institutional trust could be safely harnessed rather than would inevitably turn to destroy the remaining guardrails of the state itself. The final collapse came with brutal speed. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burned in an act of arson whose precise origins remain debated by historians to this day, though a Dutch council communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was captured at the scene and later executed for the act. The extent of any broader Nazi involvement in planning the fire remains a matter of historical dispute rather than settled fact. Regardless of its origin, the Nazi leadership immediately exploited the fire as evidence of an imminent communist uprising, persuading Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree the following day, suspending most civil liberties and political freedoms guaranteed under the Weimar Constitution. Mass arrests of communist and socialist political opponents followed within weeks. Then, in March 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, granting Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval or presidential countersignature. Achieved through a combination of the physical exclusion and intimidation of opposition deputies and negotiated support from conservative and Catholic Center Party representatives who believed, wrongly, that constitutional norms and their own political relevance might still survive the arrangement. Within months, all other political parties were banned or dissolved, labor unions were abolished, and the federal structure of German states was dismantled in favor of centralized Nazi control. The Weimar Republic, weakened by more than a decade of compounding crises and eroded institutional trust, ceased to exist in anything but name, and within 18 months of Hindenburg's death in 1934, Hitler had merged the offices of Chancellor and President to become absolute leader of the German state. What this collapse reveals, when examined not as a singular catastrophe, but as the endpoint of a longer process, is how trust between a state and its citizens erodes cumulatively rather than instantaneously. It was not any single betrayal, not Versailles alone, not hyperinflation alone, not the Depression alone, not the failures of parliamentary coalition government alone, that destroyed the Weimar Republic. It was the accumulation of repeated experiences in which citizens watched the institutions meant to protect them fail to do so again and again across more than a decade, until a critical mass of the population concluded that the system itself, rather than any particular policy or leader, was the source of their suffering. Once that conclusion takes hold widely enough, citizens become willing to accept almost any alternative that promises order and dignity, even one built on the deliberate destruction of the very freedoms and institutions that a healthy trust in the state depends upon. The lesson extends well beyond interwar Germany. Historians and political scientists studying the collapse of trust in state institutions across other contexts, the late Roman Empire's inability to protect its frontiers or currency, the final decades of the Russian Empire before 1917, the institutional decay that preceded numerous 20th century collapses of democratic governance, repeatedly find the same underlying pattern. Legitimacy is not lost in a single moment, but bled away through repeated failures, and the resulting vacuum does not remain empty for long. Something always moves in to fill it, and that something is rarely more accountable, more transparent, or more protective of ordinary citizens than the institutions it replaces. It is, more often, considerably worse, precisely because it was built and sustained not through the patient work of earning trust, but through the far faster and more destructive process of exploiting its absence. The story of Weimar Germany's collapse stands as one of history's starkest warnings. A democracy does not require a single dramatic betrayal to die. It only requires enough small ones, repeated long enough, that its citizens stop believing anything better is possible.